Hey everyone, this is Mike, and over the last few days I've made some videos talking about the ranged physical DPS, and one of them was also where I kind of compared the difference of raid DPS and actual DPS. Now in that video I also pulled up the current balance of all of the different jobs, where I talked about how the ranged physical role is very well balanced within itself, but it is not quite balanced when we look at the DPS in general. And the term that was kind of reoccurring in most of those videos was ranged attacks. And this means that basically the ranged are going to be dealing less damage because they have a much easier time to deal their damage than a caster or a melee. If we look at melee DPS, they need to stay close to the boss in order to deal their damage in the first place. And on top of that, they also have their positionals. And then when it comes down to the casters, they have cast times and thus need to plan their movement around the mechanics, around the different fights. So it requires quite a bit of optimization as well in order to not lose DPS from having to move around those mechanics, or for example when a boss is phasing away, or you need to move someplace else or something like that, that you don't lose too much damage. And when it comes down to the ranged role, they don't really have any of these issues, and it wasn't really that clear to me until yesterday. I played Machinist in Shiva. Yesterday some of my friends invited me to do weeklies, because my group stopped doing weeklies, but I still can use some gear for some of my alts, so I was like, you know what, why not? Let me join and have some fun on Machinist. And it wasn't until then that I really realized that it is so incredibly easy to play. If you haven't been following me for a while, I started this raid tier on caster, I played all three of them, then I switched over to tank for optimization, which basically a tank is a melee DPS minus the positionals, and then I've also played some samurai for like a few weeks of weeklies as well towards the end. So I'm very comfortable playing a caster or playing a melee in these fights, but I never really played ranged, and it wasn't until yesterday that I realized that it's actually so much easier to play ranged than either of these other two roles, or three roles if we're taking the tanks into account as well, because of just the freedom of movement is so insane. Now, because of that, I do kind of feel like it would be fair for there to be a ranged attacks. Melees need to be close to the boss, casters need to figure out their movement, ranged don't have to think about anything at all, and they can just do their damage at all times. And that is also one of the reasons why the ranged physical role is very strong at lower levels of play. Because when we look at the lower levels of play, people can't keep their melee uptime all the time. People haven't figured out their movement on their casters, because you don't have to do either on the ranged physical role. They're going to be performing better because they are so much easier to play. Now, when it comes down to job balance, we of course always like to look at the high-end players, because that is where you can really see what these jobs are capable of. And it is also right there that we can see that the ranged physical role is lacking in damage quite a bit. And I'll put it on screen real quick, the graph as well. I am going to be using raid DPS to compare these, because I think raid DPS is the best way to compare jobs against each other balance-wise, because it takes into account what you can provide to the raid and such as well. And we can see that there is a clear difference between like all of the different DPSs as well. But what is really clear is that the ranged physical is just lacking in damage quite a bit. It's not just a small difference like there is with most of the other DPSs. Then of course Summoner, Samurai, Black Mage are kind of like shooting outwards over there on the top, but then at the bottom the three ranged physicals are lagging behind quite a bit, and I would like to see this gap close, to be honest. Now, the main reason for that is that difficulty has never really been something that translates into damage. Like, it's not because you're playing the hardest job in the game that your job is also meant to do the most DPS in the game, because if we were to look at, for example, two of the melees, Samurai and Monk, you would actually interchange these two, because if you were to ask a lot of people, you would say that Samurai is very easy to play and that Monk is very difficult to play. Now, of course, I do know that if you want to play Samurai at the highest level, there is a lot of optimization that goes into it, but if you were to just pick up and play, if you were to learn the basics of Samurai, it's a much simpler job to play. And even at the highest level, I do believe that Monk is a whole lot harder to play than something like a Samurai. But if we were to look at this graph again, you can see that Samurai is just behind Black Mage by only 100 DPS or so, but then Monk is lagging behind all the way at the bottom, not including our ranged physicals, of course. So why is it that Samurai can be up there, even though it's a lot easier to play, than Monk, and Monk is all the way at the bottom, even though in my opinion Monk is the hardest job to play in the game? So if you were to look at this, if you were to think about the fact that difficulty does not equal damage, why does our ranged role need to be all the way at the bottom and by so much as well? Now, I do do believe that the ranged role should be at the bottom, because of course they don't have to care about melee uptime, positionals, cast times, but I don't think they should be at the bottom by so much. They should only be slightly behind the other jobs, because this just doesn't really make for good balance. Of course, at the moment we have two different team compositions that we think about, and that is the double melee, which has been standard for many years at this point, and starting in patch 5.1 a lot more people have been starting to switch to double caster because of how melee unfriendly some of the fights are. Double caster at the moment is also really strong with how strong Black Mage and Summoner are at the moment, but still it's a pretty good composition to have if you're having trouble with keeping melee uptime on some fights. Shiva is a very good example of that. So those are pretty much the two comps that most people are running, double melee or double caster, but double ranged is just something that is never thought about because of how bad the current ranged DPSs are. You still want to have one in your party at all times because they provide that, 2% rate DPS boost right now, because of having the unique roles in your party will boost the party's stats. But outside of them just being there for this 2%, so to speak, you don't really want to have a second one in there, because a second melee or a second caster is going to be giving you so much more DPS. And yesterday was also very apparent. When I was playing Machinist, we never killed it, by the way, on Machinist, when I was playing Machinist. Not necessarily because we didn't have the DPS, but because people were messing up mechanics. But whenever I switched to Red Mage, and then the Red Mage that you can see in this party switched to Summoner, we actually were smashing the DPS check. We were doing so much more DPS, and not only that, when a bunch of people died, I could just chain rest people on Red Mage, which you might see that gameplay maybe tomorrow or something, because I'm thinking of doing something about Red Mage soon. But basically, whenever we were doing double ranged, our DPS was so much lower than if we were to do double caster or double melee, for example, and that is something that I would like to see changed. When it comes down to casual play, it is still totally fine to take double ranged into whatever you want. Shiva Savage might be the exception to that, but pretty much any other content in the game, it's not ultimate rates, for example, although the old ultimate rates you can totally do that, as the DPS check in those is just stupid at this point, which I might make a video on in the future as well. But when it comes down to normal content, like normal Savages, excluding Shiva maybe, and even Shiva, it works there as well. You can take double ranged, but when it comes down to going for week 1 clears, ultimate when that is current, I don't really think that double range is ever something that we will see if they do not buff their damage output. Right now, I feel like the ranged tax is being taxed a little bit too much, and I would like to see the gap close. I do still think that, as I said, they should remain at the bottom, but they shouldn't be at the bottom by this much. They should only be behind on the other jobs by maybe a few hundred DPS instead of the almost 1,000 DPS that they are behind right now, because I do think that that is a little bit too much. So that's pretty much my opinion on this whole matter. Yes, I think range tags should exist. Yes, I think they should be performing a little bit worse at the maximum level than these other jobs are, because as I said, the ranged role performs really well at the lower levels of play. It just performs really bad at the high levels of play, and I would like to see that changed at least a little bit as well, to make them more viable at high levels of play as well. So let me know what you think about all of this. Do you think the range should be buffed? Do you think they are already too powerful because they are so easy to play? Let me know in the comments down below. But that's gonna be it for me. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.